The wind that comes down through the Bitterroot Mountains in late October does not announce itself. It arrives without warning, without ceremony, slipping through the pine stands and limestone crevices, with the quiet authority of something that has existed long before men built their cabins and drew their property lines and convinced themselves they owned any piece of this ancient, indifferent wilderness. Clara Ashford knew that wind. She had learned it the way you learn anything that can kill you through prolonged, unwilling exposure, through mistakes corrected just barely in time, through the particular education that comes only from surviving something that had no obligation to let you survive. She was sitting on the dusty floor of a limestone cave when she counted the matches for the second time. 11. She spread them across her palm in the faint light, each wooden stick, a small, fragile covenant between herself and continued existence. 11, not 12. She counted again because the mind under pressure finds comfort in verification, even when verification changes nothing. 11 matches. Outside, the first serious snowfall of the season had begun. Not the tentative flurries of early October that melted before they reached the ground, but the deliberate, committed snow of a Montana winter that had finally made up its mind. It fell straight down in the absence of wind, thick and silent, accumulating on the ledge outside the cave entrance, with the patience of something that had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world to get there. Clara was 34 years old. She had served 2 years as a surgical nurse with a combat unit overseas, had worked in conditions where the boundary between medicine and improvisation dissolved entirely, where the tools available determined what was possible, and what was possible determined who lived. She had learned in those years to assess a situation without the luxury of panic, to inventory what existed rather than mourn what did not, to treat the present moment as the only moment that mattered, because in her experience the future was a place that required active construction. She applied that same discipline now in this cave, with her 11 matches and her hunting knife in the small tin box of charcloth that had survived the journey from the settlement boundary to this limestone hollow 5 miles into the mountains. She applied it because the alternative was to think about Daniel. And if she thought about Daniel, she would stop moving. And if she stopped moving, the cold that was already working its way through her single wool blanket and the inadequate layers of her clothing would finish the job that Reverend Elias Vance had started. She could not afford to think about Daniel. Not yet. So she counted her matches instead. 3 weeks earlier, on a morning when the frost had turned the cabin windows into sheets of opaque glass, Clara had woken to silence. That was the first thing wrong. Daniel Ashford never slept past dawn. In 4 years of marriage, through illness and exhaustion and the deep bone weariness that came from building a life from raw Montana wilderness, the man had risen before the sun with the mechanical reliability of a tide. He was always first to the cook stove, always the one whose movements she heard through the floorboards as she surfaced from sleep, the sound of him becoming the sound of morning itself, as reliable and unremarkable as the light. That morning, there was no sound. Clara lay still for a moment, listening to the silence with the trained attention of someone who understood that the wrong kind of quiet was itself a form of information. Then she pulled on her wool socks, stepped onto the cold plank floor, and walked into the main room. The cook stove was cold. The coffee pot was empty. The chair where Daniel sat each morning to pull on his boots stood empty, and his boots were gone from their place beside the door. She called his name into the stillness. The cabin absorbed the sound without returning it. She checked the porch where he sometimes stood to watch the sun crest over the eastern ridgeline. Empty. She checked the small outbuilding where he kept his geological tools, his rock hammers and core sample cases, and the leather notebooks he filled with the precise, methodical handwriting of a man who believed that documentation was the closest thing to truth that human beings could manage. Empty. She found him 2 miles away at the old timber site that the previous homesteaders had abandoned before Salvation Creek was ever established. A ponderosa pine lay across his chest, its root ball exposed where it had pulled free from the frozen ground, its trunk massive enough that 3 men could not have encircled it with their arms. A logging accident. That was what the men of Salvation Creek called it when they arrived an hour later, drawn by some communication network that Clara had never been made fully aware of. They came with somber faces and quiet voices, and the particular gravity of men performing a ritual they had prepared for in advance. Reverend Elias Vance walked at the front of the procession, his pale hands folded across his chest, his expression composed into something that was meant to read as grief but registered to Clara's precise an unwilling observation as satisfaction carefully managed. He was a tall man, lean in the way that suggested not hardship, but austerity, chosen as an aesthetic with eyes the color of winter sky, that held a steadiness she had once interpreted as spiritual calm, and now understood as the steadiness of a man who had already made his decisions and no longer needed to interrogate them. They carried Daniel home on a litter of saplings and canvas. They laid him on the rough-hewn table in the main room with the careful reverence of men who were making sure to do the visible parts correctly. Clara waited until they stepped back. Then she moved to her husband's body and examined him with the clinical detachment she had acquired during 2 years of working on men whose injuries required assessment before emotion. She found what she was looking for within 30 seconds. The bruising on Daniel's neck was partially obscured by the collar of his work shirt, and she understood immediately that this was not accidental. Someone had arranged the shirt with care, pulling the fabric up to cover what the tree alone had not put there. But Clara had seen bruising patterns and configurations that told stories, and this one told a story that had nothing to do with falling timber. The marks were bilateral symmetric positioned at the carotid arteries, with a precision that spoke of deliberate application. Not the chaotic bruising of a man struck by falling weight. The focused bruising of hands that had known exactly where to press and for how long. She stood there for 3 seconds processing the information. Then she smoothed Daniel's collar back into place, straightened up, and turned to face Reverend Vance with an expression that gave him nothing. She had learned in her years overseas that the most dangerous thing a person in a vulnerable position could do was reveal the full extent of what they knew. Information disclosed prematurely became a target. Information held quietly became a weapon. So she said nothing about what she had seen. She thanked the men for bringing her husband home. She accepted Vance's words of condolence with a lowered gaze. She let them believe she was a grieving widow, stunned and confused, leaning on the community for support. It was the most difficult performance of her life, and she executed it without a single false note. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small cemetery at the eastern edge of Salvation Creek in a clearing of pine trees that the settlers had designated as sacred ground in the first months of the community's establishment. One of the 47 residents attended. The others sent word of illness or pressing work, which was the polite language of people who could not bring themselves to participate, but also could not bring themselves to refuse. Clara stood at the graveside in her good coat, the one she kept for Sundays and occasions that required her to present a version of herself that was separate from the daily work of survival. The temperature was below freezing. Her breath made small clouds in the still air. She watched them lower the wooden casket that Daniel's neighbor had built in 2 days from seasoned pine, working through the nights with a lantern and a set of hand tools refusing payment. She was grateful for that. She filed it away alongside the other things she was grateful for, because gratitude was something to be carried carefully during difficult times, held close and protected from the cold. Ruth Mercer stood beside her during the service. They had been friends since the second month after Clara and Daniel's arrival at Salvation Creek, a friendship that had developed with the particular intensity that forms between women in isolated circumstances, where the usual abundance of social connection is stripped away, and what remains is either genuine or nothing. Clara had sat with Ruth through 3 nights of pneumonia the previous winter, cooling her fever with wet cloths, monitoring her breathing with professional attention, sleeping in the chair beside Ruth's bed in 90-minute intervals so she could be awake when needed. When Reverend Vance finished the words about God's mysterious purposes and the faithful departed, Clara turned to Ruth and reached for her hand. Ruth pulled away. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a small, definitive withdrawal, her hand retreating before Clara's fingers could close around it, her eyes moving sideways to a point somewhere beyond Clara's left shoulder. Clara let her own hand fall back to her side. She stood very still for a moment, processing this new piece of information, fitting it into the pattern she was assembling with the same methodical care that Daniel had applied to his geological surveys. Ruth Mercer knew, not suspected, knew. The withdrawal was not the flinching of someone caught between loyalty and fear. It was the gesture of someone who had already made their choice and was now managing the discomfort of standing next to the consequences. Which meant that at least some members of Salvation Creek had known what was going to happen to Daniel before it happened, had known and had chosen the community's stability over one man's life. Clara kept her face still. She kept her hands at her sides. She watched them finish filling in the grave, and she listened to the final hymn, and she thanked the people who offered their condolences one by one, looking each of them in the eye with an expression of composed grief that revealed nothing of what she was actually doing, which was memorizing their faces and their words and the particular quality of their discomfort. Elias Vance had founded Salvation Creek in 1972, 6 years before Daniel's death, bringing 17 families from various parts of the American West, with the promise of a community organized around principles of Christian fellowship, shared labor, and mutual support. The land in the Bitterroot Valley was remote but arable, the water clean, the timber plentiful. The charter he had written and had the founding families sign established the community's governance structure, its system of shared resources, its dispute resolution process, and buried in the document's 14th article, the provision that would eventually be used against Clara. Article 14 stated that in the event of a member's death, the surviving spouse would retain full rights to shared property only so long as they could demonstrate an ability to contribute to the community at a level commensurate with their resource consumption. A widow without income, without the physical capacity for heavy labor, without specialized skills, the community required such a widow could be asked to surrender the homestead to the collective trust and depart. It was the kind of provision that sounded in the abstract like a practical measure against dependency. In practice, it was a mechanism for dispossession, and the people who had signed the charter had either not read it carefully enough or had trusted Vance enough not to see it as something that might one day be turned against them. Clara had read the charter. She had read it twice in the first weeks after their arrival, and she had mentioned to Daniel that Article 14 made her uneasy. Daniel had laughed gently and said that Vance was a man of principle and that the article was there to protect the community against genuine dependency, not to harm people who were already contributing members. Daniel had been wrong, and the knowledge that he had been wrong, that his fundamental trust in human decency had been the vulnerability that allowed the trap to be set, was one of the pieces of information Clara kept very carefully away from her emotional center, because if she let herself feel what she felt about it, she would not be able to do what needed to be done. 21 days after they buried Daniel at 4 o'clock in the morning, when the sky was still the deep purple black of pre-dawn and the temperature had dropped overnight to the edge of dangerous, Clara heard boots on her porch. Heavy boots, multiple pairs. She was already awake. She had not been sleeping well since the funeral, lying in the bed she had shared with Daniel, and listening to the silence where his breathing used to be running calculations in her mind about what was coming and when and how. The boots on the porch confirmed the timing, if not the specific hour. She pulled on her robe and opened the door. Reverend Elias Vance stood at the front, flanked by Holt Briggs and Owen Sutter and Garrison Mercer. Behind them at the edge of the lamplight, a small cluster of settlers stood in the cold witnesses to what was about to be enacted in their name. Vance did not waste time on preamble. His voice was flat and administrative, carrying the particular tone of a man who has convinced himself that the thing he is doing is not personal but procedural, that he is not making a choice but executing a decision that has already been made and ratified by a process that legitimizes whatever follows. He told her about Article 14. He told her about the council vote. He told her about Daniel's debts to the community, the seed borrowed from common stores, the tools maintained by collective labor, the cabin raised with the help of neighbors. He told her that a widow alone could not contribute an equivalent share and that the community could not sustain members who could not sustain themselves. She had 1 hour to collect what she could carry. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting. She was listening not just to the words, but to the gaps between them, to the things not said, to the particular way Vance's voice moved across certain phrases too smoothly, the practiced smoothness of lines rehearsed until the roughness was gone. When he finished, she looked at him with the steadiness she had maintained since the funeral. Daniel built this cabin, she said, with his own hands and his own money saved before we arrived at this settlement. The seed was paid for. The tools were returned. We owe this community nothing that has not already been repaid. Vance looked at her the way men look at inconvenient truths, briefly, dismissively, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to keep moving past obstacles by refusing to acknowledge their weight. The council has voted, he said. Article 14 is clear. Holt Briggs moved into the cabin without waiting for further invitation, a rolled document in his hand that he pressed against her chest hard enough to make her take a step backward. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had settled over the years into an expression of permanent low-level contempt, the face of someone who had learned early that size was a form of argument, and had never found reason to develop any other kind. Clara looked past Vance to the assembled witnesses. She found Ruth Mercer in the group standing near the back with her arms wrapped around her middle and her eyes fixed on the ground. Garrison stood beside his wife with his jaw set and his hands still at his sides, a man who had not yet decided what he was and was hoping the decision would somehow be made for him by circumstances. The hour passed in a kind of waking dream, the unreality that descends when events move beyond what the mind has prepared itself for, and the body simply continues functioning because it does not know what else to do. Holt stood in this doorway watching her pack the Winchester rifle cradled in his arms as a reminder of the available range of outcomes. When she reached for Daniel's heavy wool coat on its hook by the door, Holt shook his head. Community property. Leave it. When she moved toward the rifle above the mantel, the one Daniel had taught her to shoot when the coyotes started coming for the chickens in the spring of their first year, the one she had practiced with until she could reliably hit a tin can at 50 yards, Holt stepped forward to intercept her. "Can't have you coming back armed," he said. There was something in his voice that was not quite pleasure, but was adjacent to it, the satisfaction of a man in the middle of doing exactly what he was built to do. In the end, she was permitted the following: one wool blanket, the clothes on her back, a canvas rucksack containing 2 days of dried venison and hardtack, a hunting knife with a 4-inch blade, the small tin box with flint and steel, and a piece of charcloth and a box of 11 matches. The 12th match had been used that morning to light the stove for coffee. She had not yet had time to replace it from the reserve supply in the pantry, which was now community property. 11 matches. Holt Briggs and Owen Sutter walked her 2 miles to the property boundary, the rusted barbed wire fence that marked the edge of what Salvation Creek had claimed as its own. Beyond it, the pine forest rose in darkness, the mountain slopes ascending into invisible heights. The snow beginning now in earnest, small flakes that moved sideways in the first gusts of what would become the season's first real storm. Holt rested his hand on his sidearm. He looked at her with the particular expression of a man who wanted to be looked back at so he could measure his impact. "Don't come back," he said. "You cross this fence again, you'll be treated as a hostile trespasser. May God watch over your soul." He said it the way people say things they don't mean, in the company of people whose opinion they want, performing a courtesy as a demonstration of character. Then he and Owen turned and walked back toward the settlement, and she heard Owen say something she could not quite make out, and she heard Holt laugh, and then the snow thickened, and the distance swallowed both the voices and the laughter, and she was alone. The nearest town was Missoula, 40 miles through wilderness that did not know or care about the distinction between the living and the dead. The mountain passes would be impassable within 2 weeks when the heavy snow arrived. To be expelled now was a death sentence delivered with paperwork. This was not an oversight or an excess of procedural zeal. This was the point. Clara stood at the fence line for 90 seconds. She counted them. She allowed herself 90 seconds to stand in the cold and the snow and feel the full weight of what had happened. The loss of Daniel, the loss of the life they had built, the calculated cruelty of what was being done to her, and the careful legal architecture that had been constructed to make it look like something other than what it was. Then she stepped over the fence, not toward Missoula. The passes were not yet closed, but the 40 miles in the dark with no coat and an arriving storm was a different kind of death sentence administered more quickly. 40 miles on open trails in what she was wearing was a calculation that did not resolve in her favor. But 5 miles northeast up treacherous slopes and through dense forest that she would have to navigate by memory and by moonlight, there was a place that no one in Salvation Creek knew about. A place Daniel had shown her the previous summer during a long afternoon of tracking a wounded buck. A place he had revealed with the particular quiet enthusiasm of a man sharing something precious. She had been walking beside him through thick forest when he stopped at the base of a limestone cliff and turned to her with that expression she associated with his best discoveries, the expression that made him look younger and more certain than the world usually allowed him to appear. He pulled aside a curtain of dead ivy and showed her the narrow opening in the rock. "Nobody in Salvation Creek knows this place exists," he had said. At the time, she had taken this as the simple pleasure of a private discovery, a man's delight in having found something that was only his, only theirs. Standing at the fence line in the dark and the snow, she understood it differently. She understood it as a man who had been keeping geological notebooks for a year, who had been conducting surveys that he had not discussed with the community leadership, who had been moving through the mountains, with the methodical purpose of someone building toward a conclusion. A man who had understood, perhaps before she had, that the place they had chosen to build their lives was not safe, that the man who led it was not what he claimed to be, that if something happened to him, she would need to know where to go. The fury that had been building in Clara Ashford since the moment she had found the marks on Daniel's neck, since the moment Ruth Mercer had pulled her hand away at the graveside, since the moment Holt Briggs had pressed that rolled document against her chest hard enough to make her stumble. That fury hardened now into something structural. Not an emotion, a foundation. The thing she would build everything else on top of. She turned her back on Salvation Creek and stepped into the pine forest. The terrain rose sharply, and the darkness under the trees was nearly absolute, the snowfall cutting off what little moonlight the clouds had been allowing through. She moved by memory and by the feel of the slope beneath her feet, ascending northeast by the position of the wind on her face, orienting herself by the gap in the ridgeline she had noted during a summer walk months before. Her feet were wrong for this work. The leather boots she wore were meant for cabin life, for walking between buildings and crossing muddy yards, not for climbing frozen scree in the dark. Within an hour, her feet had gone past cold into the beginning stages of numbness, which she recognized and monitored the way she would have monitored it in a patient with the dispassionate attention of a clinician who has no stake in the outcome except the outcome itself. She fell twice on the slope below the limestone cliff, going down hard on hands and knees, both times feeling her palms open against the frozen stone, the blood coming slowly in the cold and then freezing in the creases of her fingers before it could reach her wrists. The second fall, she lay still for a moment, pressed against the frozen mountainside, feeling the snow collect on the back of her coat and the rock hard and immovable beneath her. She thought about Daniel in that moment. Not the Daniel on the kitchen table, not the Daniel beneath the pine tree, not the Daniel in the grave. The Daniel of the previous summer, pulling aside the ivy curtain with his free hand and the light in his eyes, when the gap in the rock appeared, that boyish excitement that had survived intact through everything the world had done to reduce it. She got up. The ivy curtain hung dead and brittle with the season's frost, and for a moment she was certain the entrance had been sealed by rockfall, that the winter had taken this too, that the last thread of hope she had followed through 5 miles of darkness and cold and falling snow had led to a wall of limestone. But when she pressed through the tangle of dead vines, the narrow gap was there. She squeezed through into the cave and the wind stopped. The sound of the storm cut off as suddenly as if a door had been closed, replaced by the deep, absolute silence of stone. The air inside was cold but still, and the stillness alone, the simple absence of wind against her skin, felt like something given. Clara Ashford collapsed onto the dusty floor of the cave. She allowed herself 30 seconds of shaking, of the violent, involuntary trembling that comes when the body finally releases the tension it has been holding against the cold. 30 seconds of something close to relief, though relief was not quite the right word for what a person feels when they have survived the first of many things that are still trying to kill them. Then she sat up. 11 matches. She took out the tin box with the charcloth and the flint and steel. Her fingers were clumsy with cold, the fine motor control that surgery had developed in her hands, reduced now to blunt, imprecise movements that required twice the normal effort to accomplish half the normal result. It took 6 strikes of the flint before a spark caught the charcloth, and the cloth began to smolder, and she cupped it in her damaged hands and fed it carefully with shredded bark from the lining of her rucksack. The flame took, small and adequate, almost insulting in its insignificance against the vast cold pressing in from all directions. But real, actual warmth at the center of actual light. Clara fed the fire with the debris that had blown into the cave entrance over months and years. Dry pine needles, small twigs, a fragment of bark. She built it slowly, carefully, the way you build anything that matters. With attention, with patience, without hurrying past the steps that must not be hurried past. When the fire was established enough to sustain itself for a few minutes, without her constant attention, she sat back and looked at the cave around her by its light. The chamber stretched back perhaps 40 feet before narrowing into a passage too tight for a person to navigate. The ceiling rose to 15 feet at its highest point. There was a natural chimney in the rock above the fire, a crack that angled upward through the stone and would carry the smoke out through the mountain surface somewhere above. Daniel had named it Whispering Hollow for the sound the wind made when conditions were right and the air moved through the stone in a particular way. She had laughed when he told her the name. It had seemed extravagant to name a cave. She was not laughing now. She was looking at the space with the eyes of someone evaluating a resource, measuring its dimensions, assessing its defensive qualities, calculating how long the wood debris near the entrance might last, and what she would need to do before morning to increase the odds that she would still be alive by the time it ran out. She was a surgical nurse with 2 years of field experience, 11 matches of 4-inch knife, 2 days of food, and no coat. She was also the only person who knew what had been done to her husband and why. And she was alive. For tonight alive was enough. Tomorrow she would need more than alive. Tomorrow she would need to begin the work that would determine whether this cave was the place she survived or the place they eventually found her, frozen her bones, a problem resolved by spring. But tonight she fed the fire and let the warmth begin its slow recovery of her hands, and she did not think about Daniel, and she did not think about what came next. And she did not think about 11 matches or 40 miles to Missoula or Elias Vance's pale eyes or Holt Briggs's smile at the fence line. She thought about the fire, the color of it, the sound of it, the irreducible fact of its existence in the darkness. She had made it. She would make the next thing too. The wind moved through the rock above her, the mountain breathing in the cold, and somewhere in the stone, the sound became almost like a voice, almost like a word, almost like the echo of a man who had stood in this exact spot the previous summer and looked at his wife with eyes that were trying to tell her something she would only understand later. Clara Ashford sat in the firelight and listened, and she began to plan. The first thing Clara Ashford learned about surviving a Montana winter alone was that survival was not a single decision made once at the beginning. It was 1,000 decisions made consecutively, each one, depending on the one before it, each one creating the conditions for the one that followed. Miss one, miscalculate one, lose focus on one, and the chain broke, and the chain breaking was the end of everything. She understood this the way she had understood surgical procedure, not as philosophy, but as operational reality. You did not think about the patient's long-term prognosis while your hands were inside the chest cavity. You thought about the next 30 seconds. You solved the problem directly in front of you with the tools directly in your hands, and you trusted that solving it correctly would create the conditions for solving the next one. This was how she approached the cave. Not as a refuge, as a project. The fire needed to last through the night, and the night was going to be long. She spent the first hour in complete darkness beyond the fire's small radius, crawling on her hands and knees across the cave floor, collecting every piece of combustible material she could locate by touch. Dried pine needles blown in through the entrance over years. Dead bark fragments. The skeletal remains of what had been a bird's nest in some prior season, now reduced to interwoven twigs, light and dry as paper. A section of deadfall branch that had somehow found its way into the cave's outer chamber, perhaps dragged by an animal, perhaps carried by wind during some long-past storm. She built a reserve pile within arm's reach of the fire. Small fuel on one side, larger pieces on the other. She fed the flame with the precision of someone who understood that the difference between a fire that lasted the night and a fire that died at 2 in the morning was not the amount of wood available, but the timing of its application. By the time the first gray light began to filter through the cave entrance, she had maintained the fire for 6 hours on materials that a less careful person would have exhausted in 2. Her hands had recovered enough sensation to be useful again. The numbness in her feet had resolved into ordinary cold pain, which she recognized as preferable to the alternative. She had not slept. She inventoried her situation with the same honesty she would have brought to a post-operative assessment, enumerating the facts without softening them and without panicking at what they revealed. 2 days of dried venison and hardtack, perhaps 3 if rationed with discipline. 1 wool blanket, 11 matches of which she had used none since the charcloth had caught on the 6th strike of the flint. 1 4-inch hunting knife. The small amount of fire-starting material she had gathered through the night. The clothes she was wearing, which were adequate for a morning walk between buildings in October and entirely inadequate for a Montana winter. No coat, no rifle, no medical supplies, no axe. The cave itself was perhaps 10 degrees warmer than the outside air, which meant that on the coldest nights of winter, when the temperature outside dropped to 30 or 35 below zero, the interior temperature would hover somewhere around 20 below. 20 below zero was not a temperature that sustained human life without active heat generation. She needed fire. For that, she needed wood. For wood, she needed to work. She went out at first light. The snowfall had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving 4 inches of fresh powder on the slope outside the cave entrance. The sky was the particular pale gray of a morning that had not yet decided what it intended to do. Her breath made dense clouds. The cold was immediate and comprehensive, pressing through the inadequate layers of her clothing with the patient thoroughness of something that had all winter to accomplish its work. She ignored it and began to study the land. The terrain within a half-mile radius of the cave was dense with fallen timber, the natural accumulation of trees that had died standing and then toppled in wind or under the weight of successive winters. Most of it was pine, which burned fast and hot, but depleted quickly. Scattered through the lower elevations, she found oak and fir hardwoods that burned slower and longer and were worth the extra effort of hauling them up the slope. The problem was volume. A single woman could carry perhaps 50 pounds of wood at one time over rough terrain. 50 pounds fed a fire for 2 hours at minimum burn rate. To survive 3 months of winter required a quantity of wood that was not achievable through individual carrying trips alone. The mathematics were simple and discouraging. She spent the first hour not gathering wood, but studying the land with the systematic attention she had learned to apply to problems that did not immediately reveal their solutions. A quarter-mile above the cave, the ridge formed a natural channel, a steep ravine that descended through the mountain from high elevation to a point roughly 100 yards from the cave entrance. The ravine was choked with pine and fir debris, the accumulated deadfall of decades piling up on both sides and partially across it. But its angle was steep and its bottom was clear, just exposed rock and frozen soil. If she could drag or roll large logs to the upper edge of this ravine, gravity would do what she could not. The logs would tumble down the slope under their own momentum, breaking against the rocks at the bottom into sections she could actually carry the final distance to the cave. She would not carry the wood to the cave. She would deliver the wood to the mountain and let the mountain carry it for her. She identified her first target, a dead oak wedged between two boulders, approximately a quarter-mile up the slope. A tree that had been dead long enough for the wood to season into the dense, dark hardwood that burned for hours. The trunk was far too heavy to carry, but with a long branch used as a lever and her own body weight applied at the right angle, she managed in 40 minutes of sustained effort to shift it free of the boulders. The oak rolled slowly at first, catching on root clusters and small rocks, stopping twice before she worked it free again. Then the slope increased, and the tree found its momentum and went down the ravine with a sound like distant thunder crashing through the channel and shattering against the rocks at the bottom into a half-dozen sections. Clara climbed down after it, breathing hard, her arms trembling from the lever work. The sections at the bottom ranged from 20 to 40 pounds each. She could carry two at a time. She carried them to the cave in 3 trips, stacking them against the inner wall away from the fire. Then she went back for more. She worked until her vision narrowed, and her legs could no longer reliably lift themselves over the debris on the slope. Then she stopped and rested inside the cave, eating half her venison ration and a handful of snow melted in the tin box over the fire. Then she went back out and worked again. By noon, she had moved what she estimated at half a cord of wood. Her shoulders had gone past pain into a distant burning that she categorized and set aside. Her back felt as though someone had been systematically working on it with a hammer. Her hands, which had largely recovered from the previous night's cold damage, were now raw and bleeding in the creases where the bark had caught and torn the skin repeatedly. She kept working. At mid-afternoon scouting for another suitable log above the ravine's upper edge, she nearly stepped over what she initially took for a rock formation, and then looking closer understood was the partial carcass of a young mule deer. A cougar kill, judging by the claw marks on the haunches. The cat had taken its fill and then been driven off probably by wolves before it could return for the rest. The carcass was partially frozen, which had slowed decomposition. The meat was intact on the forequarters, and most of the hindquarters covered in a thin crust of ice, but sound beneath it. Clara stood over the deer for a long moment. 80 pounds of protein conservatively. Fat reserves visible along the spine and around the organs. In her current circumstances, this was not a fortunate find. It was the difference between the mathematics of survival working and not working. She field-dressed the carcass with her knife, working with the efficiency of someone who has done similar work under worse conditions, removing the organs and sectioning the animal into quarters she could transport. She took everything useful, the hide, the sinew, the organs that could be eaten immediately. She carried the quarters back to the cave in 2 trips, her arms loaded past the point of comfort, moving quickly, because the scent of blood in the cold air was the kind of announcement that drew audiences she was not equipped to manage. That night, for the first time since her expulsion from Salvation Creek, she ate until she was full. She roasted venison over the fire, the fat dripping and sizzling, the smell of cooked meat filling the cave with something that registered in some wordless part of her nervous system as safety as adequacy as the body's most fundamental form of satisfaction. She ate slowly and deliberately. She allowed herself to taste it. The meat would freeze solid in the cave's natural cold storage, preserved by the same temperatures that were trying to kill her. Rationed carefully, it could sustain her for 3 weeks. 3 weeks in which she could work without the metabolic deficit of near starvation, compromising every decision she made. She fell asleep that night in the firelight and slept for 9 hours without waking. On the second day, she found the axe head. It was wedged deep in the crevice in the limestone near the back of the cave. The handle rotted away to nothing decades ago, the steel pitted with rust, but fundamentally intact. She worked it free with her knife blade, turning it over in her hands, testing the edge with her thumbnail. It held an edge, dull, neglected decades away from its last sharpening, but the geometry of the blade was sound, and the steel had not gone soft. With the sharpening stone from Daniel's box, the detail she had not yet allowed herself to fully dwell on, she spent 3 hours working the edge back to functionality. Then she spent another 2 hours fashioning a handle from a length of green oak, splitting the wood with her knife, shaping it, binding the axe head in place with leather strips cut from her belt, and soaked in water that froze around the binding as it dried, locking the whole assembly into rigidity. The result was crude. It would have embarrassed a competent craftsman. But when she tested it against a section of the oak she had brought into the cave, it split the wood cleanly on the third swing. With an axe, her efficiency tripled. The wood she had been hauling in sections from the bottom of the ravine could now be split and stacked. Larger logs that had been unmovable became workable. She could process twice the volume in the same time, and the result burned more efficiently, fitting together in the fire pit in ways that maximized heat output and minimized fuel consumption. By the end of the second week, she had accumulated 2.5 cords of mixed hardwood and softwood stacked against the cave's inner walls, in a configuration that also served as insulation. The mass of the wood absorbing and releasing heat in ways that buffered the cave's temperature against the worst of the overnight drops. She had also constructed what she thought of as the thermal mass, a ring of flat river stones arranged around the fire pit. The stones, carefully selected for density and positioned to absorb heat during the burning hours and release it slowly through the long nights when the fire was reduced to coals. It did not make the cave warm, but it made the cave survivable. These were the days she could look at later and describe simply as work. Cold, hard, relentless work performed in the methodical rhythm that she had learned was the only reliable antidote to both physical deprivation and psychological deterioration. She did not allow herself to think too far ahead. She did not allow herself to think too far back. She lived in the immediate requirements of each day, and she executed them to the best of her ability, and she went to sleep and woke up and did it again. It was in this period, in those first 2 weeks, that she also searched the cave. She had been thinking about what Daniel had said at the limestone cliff that summer afternoon. The particular way he had said it, not as a casual observation, but with the quiet specificity of a man placing emphasis where he needed it to land. Nobody in Salvation Creek knows this place exists. Not, isn't this a beautiful cave? Not, look at what I found. Nobody knows this place exists. She ran her hands along the cave walls during the hours when the light was strong enough, moving from the entrance backward, pressing her fingers into every shadow and irregularity in the stone. She examined the floor in sections. She looked at the cave not as a shelter, but as a message written in 3 dimensions by a man who had understood that the direct route was not available to him. She found it on the 12th day. Near the back of the cave at chest height on the eastern wall, a mark scratched into the limestone with a metal tool, deliberate and precise. The letter D, and below it an arrow pointing down. Not their surname. D for Daniel. The name she called him. The name that belonged to the space between them rather than to the world outside. Clara's hands were steady when she knelt and began scraping at the compacted earth with her knife blade, following the direction of the arrow. She dug with controlled urgency, not the frantic digging of desperation, but the focused digging of someone who already knows something is there and is working toward it with the confidence of prior knowledge. The knife struck metal at 6 inches. She cleared the edges with her fingers, working around the outline of an olive-drab military ammunition box, the kind designed to keep its contents dry through conditions that destroyed everything else. It was sealed with wax that had hardened into a shell over the months since Daniel had buried it here. She pried the lid with the knife, working the blade around the seal, feeling it crack and give. The lid came free. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth against the moisture that existed even in the driest stone, she found the things Daniel Ashford had left for the wife he had believed in, enough to plan for. A canvas and wool coat large, meant for his frame, but serviceable for hers if she cinched the belt. She put it on immediately and stood for a moment inside the warmth of it, feeling the difference between cold and less cold, which in this place was the difference between everything and nothing. 3 boxes of Strike Anywhere matches, 50 sticks each, 150 matches. She set them beside the 11 original matches and allowed herself one moment of something that was not quite relief, but was its structural equivalent. 2 cans of preserved peaches, their labels faded, but the seals intact. A compact sharpening stone, finer grained than the one she had found earlier, meant for the final edge on a blade that had already been brought back to functional. And at the bottom, wrapped in a second layer of oilcloth, a leather-bound journal. Clara sat on the cave floor and opened it. The pages were filled with Daniel's handwriting, the precise, methodical script she had watched fill hundreds of pages of notes over their years together. The handwriting of a man who believed that observation recorded was observation preserved. Page after page of geological survey data, hand-drawn topographical maps of the ridges north and northeast of Salvation Creek, chemical assay results for soil and rock samples, the numbers annotated with his characteristic brief notations that compress complex assessments into single, accurate phrases. She turned pages without stopping, scanning the progression of the work, understanding as she read the full scope of what Daniel had been doing during the long days he had spent in these mountains with his notebooks and his rock hammer. The days she had assumed were hunting or timber assessment, or the simple pleasure of a man who needed open country the way other men needed conversation. He had been prospecting, systematically, professionally, with the patience of a man who had the training to know what he was looking for and the discipline to look for it correctly. She turned to the final pages where his handwriting changed. The letters became smaller, more compressed, the entries shorter, the careful, methodical tone of the survey notes giving way to something more urgent. The second to last entry read, "Found it. The vein runs through the North Ridge, minimum 8 feet in width. Assay shows 97% purity, commercial value substantial. Enough to change everything about this valley. Vance knows I have been surveying. Caught me taking core samples 3 days ago. He saw the vein. I tried to deflect, but he is not stupid, and I was not careful enough." He smiled when he looked at it. Not the smile of a man who has found something beautiful. The smile of a man who has found something he intends to take. He has asked me to meet him at the old timber mill to discuss a fair arrangement. He says there is a buyer in Helena willing to form a partnership that benefits everyone. I do not believe him. I will bring my rifle. Then the last entry, dated 2 days before his death. Clara, if you are writing this, I did not come home. What happened was not an accident. The vein coordinates are on page 32. The assay samples are buried beneath the loose stone near the east wall of the cave. Take them. Take this journal. Ride to Missoula and file a claim with the county land office. The homestead is registered in both our names. The mineral rights are ours by law. Do not negotiate with Vance. Do not trust anyone in that settlement who knew what was planned and said nothing. If you cannot run, then fight. I have never stopped believing in what you are capable of. I am sorry I was not more careful. I love you entirely. Clara read those words 3 times. The grief she had been holding in careful containment since the morning she found Daniel at the timber site, holding it the way you hold pressure on a wound when the bleeding cannot be permitted, finally breached the barrier she had constructed against it. It moved through her all at once, a wave that had been building for 3 weeks behind the operational necessity of keeping herself alive. And it broke now in the firelight of the cave her husband had prepared for her. She did not make sound. The grief that is too large for sound is its own category. She held the journal against her chest, And she sat in the dark, and she let it move through her, and she did not rush it, because some things must be felt completely before they can be converted into something useful. When it was done, she was still sitting in the same position. The fire had burned down while she sat there, and she reached out with one hand and fed it without looking, the motion automatic, the body maintaining its priorities even when the mind was elsewhere. Then she opened the journal again and turned to page 32. The blizzard arrived on the third night with a violence that made every previous cold seem like a preliminary. The sound it made moving through the mountains was not wind in the conventional sense, but something larger, a systemic event, the atmosphere reorganizing itself around the season's intention. The cave entrance shook, the chimney crack and the stone above sang in pitches that shifted between registers as the wind found different angles of approach. Clara had spent the previous day preparing for exactly this. She had stacked sections of split wood across the cave entrance in an overlapping pattern that blocked wind while allowing a narrow passage for air and her own movement. She had positioned the thermal mass stones and built the fire to a size that would sustain itself on minimum feeding through the long hours when she needed to sleep. She survived the first blizzard inside the cave, feeding the fire in 4-hour intervals, sleeping in the gaps, eating measured portions of the venison, and one of the cans of preserved peaches, which she ate slowly with a piece of hardtack. The sweetness of the fruit doing something to her nervous system that was entirely out of proportion to its caloric significance. The storm lasted 72 hours. When it ended, she dug herself out through 4 feet of accumulated snow at the entrance and emerged into a world that had been comprehensively remade. The landscape was unrecognizable, the familiar shapes of the terrain erased under white that stretched in all directions without interruption. The sky was the blue of absolute cold, the particular blue that appears only when the air has been stripped of everything that is not cold and light. Clara stood in it for a moment. She noted that she was still alive. She noted that the wood supply inside the cave had diminished by roughly a third during the storm. She noted that the snare line she had established using copper wire salvaged from her rucksack's frame had been buried but was likely intact beneath the snow. Then she went back inside and began the work of the next day. December came down on the Bitterroot Mountains not as a month, but as a verdict. The temperatures that had seemed severe in November revealed themselves as preamble. The thermometer, if she had possessed one, would have shown readings that went past the standard measurements of winter cold into the territory of genuine hostility, the territory where exposed skin blackened in minutes and breath crystallized before it dispersed. Trees exploded in the freeze, their sap expanding until the trunk split with sounds like rifle shots that echoed through the canyons in the pre-dawn hours. The deer meat ran out on December 8th. She had rationed it carefully, but the body-burning calories against sub-zero temperatures was a furnace that consumed its fuel without reference to what was available. She transitioned to whatever the snares produced, supplemented by increasingly desperate foraging. Rose hips frozen on their stems, bitter and astringent and rich in vitamin C. Squirrel caches of pine nuts located by watching the animals, in the days before the deepest cold drove them underground, then raided once the squirrels had retreated. Pine cambium, the living layer scraped from beneath the dead outer bark, boiled into a paste that provided carbohydrates without anything resembling satisfaction. Pine needle tea brewed and consumed daily without exception, because scurvy was not a medieval disease, but a practical threat to anyone subsisting in the absence of fresh vegetables for months. Her body registered the deficit in ways she monitored clinically. Weight loss that accelerated when this deer meat ran out, the ribs becoming visible beneath Daniel's coat, hip bones pressing against the stone floor during sleep with a directness that woke her. Her period stopped in December, the body conserving resources with the ruthless pragmatism of a system focused entirely on maintaining core function. She noted all of this the way she would have noted a patient's declining indicators. She adjusted what she could adjust and accepted what she could not, and she kept working. The isolation was the component she had not fully calculated for, and it proved more difficult than the cold and the hunger combined. Days passed without the sound of any human voice, including her own. She began talking to herself not from loneliness, but from necessity, using speech existence against the silence that pressed in from all directions and was slowly, persistently attempting to dissolve the boundary between Clara Ashford and the stone and cold around her. She read from Daniel's journal aloud. She described what she was doing as she did it, narrating the work in the flat tone of a clinician dictating notes which gave the work a structure and a witness, even when the only witness was herself. She held arguments with the walls which did not respond, but which absorbed sound in a way that was better than nothing. The line between the woman she had been at Salvation Creek and whatever she was becoming here blurred and shifted. She was not losing her mind. She knew the difference between functional adaptations to extreme isolation and the disintegration of the self. What she was doing was closer to reduction than disintegration, the stripping away of everything that was not structurally essential, like the process that reveals the grain of the wood when everything soft has been removed. On the evening of December 20th, the temperature dropped past anything she had yet experienced. She woke from her first sleep interval to find frost forming on the inside of the cave walls. The fire had burned down to coals while she slept, and the cold had moved in with the speed of something that had been waiting. She rebuilt the fire quickly, her hands moving through the motions, and sat close to it and felt the cold pressing against her back while the heat pressed against her face. She sat there for a long time. There was a moment in the deep center of that night when she became aware of something she had not allowed herself to consciously register before. She could not clearly remember the sound of Daniel's voice. She could remember its quality, its register, the particular cadence of his speech when he was describing something he found fascinating. But the actual sound of it, the specific acoustic reality of him speaking her name, had begun to fade. This frightened her in a way that the cold and the hunger did not. She opened his journal and began to read aloud. Not the geological surveys, the margins, the small notations he had made in the corners of pages throughout the year of his surveying observations that had nothing to do with silver deposits or assay results. Brief sentences about the quality of the light on a particular afternoon. A note about the way she laughed when something surprised her. An entry about finding a meadow of late-season wildflowers and wishing she were there to see it. A line written in the very small script he used when he was writing something private that said simply, "She is the best thing I have ever done choosing her." Clara read every margin notation in the journal that night, speaking each one into the cold air of the cave, refusing to let them exist only in silence. By the time the storm broke 3 days later, she had crossed a threshold she recognized. Not a breakdown, the opposite. The thing that happens when everything non-essential has been stripped away and what remains has been tested sufficiently to know its own quality. She was still Clara Ashford. She was still standing. And she was still furious. January arrived in two voices. The first was silence, the deep freeze that followed the December storms. A cold so total that the world outside the cave ceased to make sound entirely, as though the temperature had suppressed even the possibility of noise. The second voice came on the 25th, and it broke the silence in a way that sent electricity through every nerve she possessed. The crunch of snowshoes on compacted snow. She heard it from inside the cave, faint but unmistakable. The rhythmic compression of someone moving across the frozen surface of the slope below her position. Not an animal. Animals did not move in that pattern, that deliberate, even cadence of human locomotion. Someone was out here. She was on her feet and at the entrance before the thought fully formed, moving through the snow tunnel with the automatic speed of a response that bypassed conscious decision entirely. She pressed herself against the limestone beside the cave opening and looked down through the screen of ice-laden pine branches at the valley floor below. Two figures, 200 yards distant, perhaps slightly more, moving upslope in a methodical search pattern, checking the terrain feature by feature, the way men move when they are looking for something specific and believe they will know it when they see it. She recognized Holt Briggs from his walk alone, that heavy, forward-leaning gait of a man who moved through the world as though the world owed him right of way. The second figure was younger, less certain in his movements, picking his way through the terrain with the careful hesitation of someone who had not been in this country long enough to read it. Owen Sutter. Both carried rifles with scopes. Both carried heavy winter packs. Both moved with the deliberate focus of men who had been given a specific assignment and intended to complete it. The cold air carried sound with unusual clarity. She pressed herself against the stone and listened. Holt's voice came up from below, the words arriving with the precision of a man who was not concerned about being overheard because he was certain there was nothing alive up here to hear him. Vance said the woman's husband was surveying out here for months before he died. He had to have cached his documentation somewhere. If she made it this far before the first storm, she might have found it. We find her bones, we find what she was carrying. Owen's response was quieter. She strained to catch it, and the words came in pieces, not complete sentences. 3 months. Nobody survives. Frozen somewhere under the snow. Holt's laugh was short and dismissive. Then we find the frozen body, find the journal. Either way, Vance gets what he needs before the federal surveyor shows up in April. Spread out. Look for caves, overhangs, anything with a windbreak. She was a field medic. She'd have looked for shelter. Clara pressed herself flat against the stone and took 3 even breaths. They were roughly a quarter mile from the cave entrance, moving upslope in the right direction. If they continued their current line, they would reach her position within 2 hours. She could not allow that. She could not outrun them. She had no rifle. In any direct confrontation between a woman with a 4-inch knife and 2 men with scoped rifles and a winter's worth of supplies, the outcome was not a question. But she had 3 months of knowledge of this terrain that they did not have. She had moved across every ridge and ravine within a half-mile of this cave, in every condition of weather and light. She knew where the snow was stable and where it was not, where the slope could be trusted, and where it was waiting for the right additional weight to become something else entirely. She went back into the cave and strapped on the snowshoes she had constructed from bent willow branches and strips of rawhide cut from her knife sheath, an afternoon's work from 3 weeks prior that had extended her range in the deep snow from barely functional to genuinely capable. She checked the fire, reduced it to coals that would sustain themselves for hours without feeding. She took her knife. She took nothing else. Then she moved northeast along the ridgeline, staying below the crest to avoid silhouetting herself against the sky, moving through the frozen pines with the practiced quiet of someone who had spent 3 months learning what this mountain asked of the people who moved across it. A quarter mile from the cave, the ridgeline formed the edge she had identified weeks earlier during a wood-gathering expedition taken farther than usual by the need to find accessible hardwood. The prevailing winter winds from the northwest had built massive snow cornices along the eastern face of the ridge, overhanging lips of compacted snow that jutted out over a 50-foot drop to the boulder field below. They looked solid. From above, standing on them, they would feel solid. They had the appearance of simple snowpack extending to the edge of a cliff. They were not solid. She knew this because she had spent weeks watching the way the frost formed differently on their surfaces, the way small sections released and fell after temperature swings, the way they moved almost imperceptibly during the warmest hours of midday. They were held in place by cohesion that was real but insufficient against any significant additional load. Clara moved to an exposed section of the ridge 40 yards short of the cornice field and stood there in plain view against the white sky. Then she waited. The shout came from below within 30 seconds. Holt's voice sharp and carrying the quality of a man who has found what he was looking for. A rifle shot followed almost immediately. The sound arriving a full second after the impact, the bullet struck limestone 12 feet to her left, sending chips of stone across the snow in a small spray. Clara dropped flat and began moving. Fast, deliberate, leaving a track in the snow that anyone following it would read as panic, the wide, irregular spacing of someone running without control. The track of a person who had been frightened into unplanned movement and was going wherever the ground allowed. She ran directly toward the cornice field, 50 yards short of the unstable snow. She cut sharply left and dove into the dense cover of a spruce tree whose lower branches had been buried by the season's accumulation, creating a cavity of shadow beneath the hanging white weight. She burrowed into this space and pulled her blanket, which she wore wrapped around her upper body like a shawl, over herself, pressing it against the snow to eliminate contrast. She became still, the kind of still she had learned in the cave during the weeks of deep winter when the cold pressed hardest. The stillness that was not passivity but concentration, every sense directed outward. She heard them crest the ridge 8 minutes later. Their voices came first, then the sound of their snowshoes on the compacted snow of the ridgeline, heavier and more aggressive than her own passage had been. Holt's voice carried easily. "She's not thinking straight. Look at this trail. She's running scared, no plan, just moving. We can end this right now." Owen's response came lower. She was not able to hear all of it, but she heard the word wrong, and she heard the word widow, and she heard the hesitation in Owen Sutter's voice that was not caution about terrain, but something harder to name, the sound of a man who had agreed to something and was now too late understanding what he had agreed to. Holt did not slow down. She tracked their position by sound, by the compression of the snow under their weight, by the changing acoustic quality of their voices as they moved from the exposed ridge surface toward the area where the cornice began. They were following her tracks precisely. Her tracks led where she had intended them to lead. 20 feet onto the cornice, then 15, then 10. Owen stopped. She heard him stop. The cessation of his snowshoe rhythm against the snow was a distinct sound in the silence. He said something she could not hear fully. The word feels, the word right. Holt's response was short and dismissive, and she heard the sound of one man moving and one man being pushed into movement. Then both sets of footfalls were on the cornice. She held her breath. The crack when it came was not the dramatic sound she had imagined. It was a single sharp report, almost modest like a green branch taken past its limit. Then a deeper sound beneath it, a structural shifting, the groan of a mass that has exceeded its tolerance and is beginning to acknowledge what physics has been telling it. Owen Sutter screamed. It was a short sound, the sound of a person who has had the floor removed without warning and has not yet reached the bottom. Then the cornice released in a single mass, a 40-foot section of compacted snow separating from the ridge with the finality of a decision that cannot be unmade, and both men went down with it into the ravine below in a cascade of white that raised a cloud of displaced snow above the edge and then settled into silence. Clara waited. She waited for a full hour motionless in the spruce cavity before she moved. When she finally approached the edge of the ravine and looked down through the shattered debris of what had been the cornice, she found them in the broken landscape of ice and stone below. Owen Sutter had landed against a boulder at the angle that required no further examination. He had not suffered. She held that thought and made herself keep it, because whatever Owen had been or had agreed to, he had also been the one who stopped on the ridge and said wrong. Holt Briggs was alive. I was pinned from the waist down under a slab of consolidated ice, the size of a wagon bed, his upper body free. His face turned up toward the ridge with an expression that moved through the registers of shock and pain and terror in the time it took her to find a route down into the ravine. She picked her way down through the debris field, carefully testing each step, aware that the remaining snow above was now unstable and that speed was not the correct response to this environment. When she reached him, he was watching her with eyes that held something she recognized as the specific fear of a man who has spent his life being the one with the power to decide outcomes and is now confronting a situation in which that power has been entirely revoked. His rifle lay 7 feet away intact, the scope undamaged. His pack had torn partially open in the fall. She could see dried beef ammunition boxes, a thermos. A wool coat lined with sheepskin lay half buried in the snow beside him, dislodged by the impact. Holt's voice when he spoke was not the voice she remembered from the fence line. That voice had been certain of itself. This voice was asking for something. Clara, please, in the name of God. She moved to where he lay and looked at him with the assessment she had learned in field conditions, the automatic inventory of injury and prognosis. She was thorough. She was accurate. She was fast. Then she stood up. The mountain has made its judgment, she said. She walked to the rifle and picked it up. She checked the chamber, the action, the scope. She collected the ammunition from his pack, the dried beef, the thermos. She lifted the wool coat from the snow and shook it once to clear the ice. Holt's voice followed her as she worked, moving through registers she did not respond to. Please, bargaining. The name of God invoked repeatedly by a man who had stood on her porch at 4 in the morning and invoked the same God with the same mouth while taking everything she owned. She put on the coat over Daniel's canvas jacket. The warmth was immediate and real. She shouldered the rifle and the pack. She did not look back at Holt Briggs again. She climbed out of the ravine and walked back toward Whispering Hollow in the late afternoon light, her snowshoes moving her smoothly across the surface of the snow, the weight of the rifle on her shoulder. Something she had not had and now did the difference between one mathematics and another, one set of possibilities and an entirely different set. Behind her, the temperature was continuing to drop toward the numbers it reached after sundown in January in the Bitterroot Mountains. She was aware of this, the way she was aware of all relevant facts. She walked without looking back. The cave welcomed her with the same dry stillness it always did, the same deep silence of stone that it had nothing to prove to the wind. She rebuilt the fire from the coals she had banked before leaving and fed it steadily until the cave reached the temperature she recognized as the threshold between endurance and function. She brewed pine needle tea with the water she melted in the tin box. She opened the thermos Holt had been carrying and drank what was inside, which was coffee, real coffee still carrying the last of its warmth, the first coffee she had tasted in 3 months. She sat with the cup between her hands and felt the warmth move through the ceramic into her palms and from her palms into the rest of her. And she did not think about what she had just done or had just failed to do, because both framings were accurate and neither one changed what came next. What came next was February. What came next was a rifle and the ability to hunt. What came next was the slow return of her body's strength as adequate protein became available again and her muscles rebuilt themselves on the material she was finally able to give them. What came next was spring, and what came after spring was Elias Vance still in his settlement, still believing that the problem of Clara Ashford had been resolved by the January cold and the men he had sent to confirm it. Clara set the empty cup down and opened Daniel's journal to page 32. She studied the coordinates of the silver vein until she had memorized them. Then she closed the journal and looked at the fire for a long time. She was not finished. She was in fact just now beginning. February came to the Bitterroot Mountains, the way a sentence comes after a long pause with the weight of everything that preceded it and the clarity of something that has been decided. Clara Ashford woke on the first morning of the month to a sky that was still dark and a fire that had burned to deep red coals and a body that was for the first time in weeks hungry rather than starving. There is a difference between those two states that anyone who has experienced both will recognize immediately. Hunger is the body asking for something it expects to receive. Starvation is the body asking for something it has stopped expecting. The return of ordinary hunger was its own kind of information. The body's report that the margin between survival and failure had widened enough to allow for expectation again. She lay still for a moment and listened to the cave. The wind had dropped overnight. The deep cold of January had not broken, it would not break for weeks yet, but it had settled into a steadiness that was easier to work within than the violent fluctuations of the previous month. Steady cold was manageable. Steady cold could be calculated against plan for addressed with the methodical discipline she had spent 3 months developing into something close to instinct. She got up and rebuilt the fire and melted snow for water and ate a measured portion of the dried beef from Holt Briggs's pack. Then she took the Winchester rifle she had brought back from the ravine and she went outside. She had been shooting every day for the past week, working through the mechanics of the weapon with the systematic patience she had applied to everything else in this cave. The rifle was a finer instrument than the one that had been taken from her. Better balanced, better sighted, the scope calibrated to a precision that revealed itself in the way the crosshairs settled and held at distance. She had set targets in the snow at increasing ranges, sections of split wood pressed into the snowpack at 50 yards, then 100, then 150. This morning she walked 200 yards from the cave entrance and set a piece of bark against a pine's trunk. She walked back without looking at it. She raised the rifle, found the target in the scope, controlled her breath, the way she had been taught to control it, long before she ever held a rifle in the rhythmic discipline of surgical work, where the hand that trembles costs lives. She fired once. She walked to the pine tree and looked at the bark. The bullet had taken the center. She was ready. She found the buck on the third day of hunting, a large mule deer moving through the sparse timber on the south-facing slope, where the snow was shallower and the dry grass beneath it was accessible to animals that knew where to look. He was moving upwind of her position, which gave her the time to settle into stillness against a pine trunk and wait for the angle she wanted. She did not rush it. In the field hospital conditions she had worked in overseas, the surgeons she respected most were the ones who did not hurry past the preparation, who understood that the 30 seconds spent confirming the approach were not 30 seconds lost, but 30 seconds that prevented the mistakes that cost an hour to correct. She had carried that understanding into everything she did, and she carried it now, waiting in the cold, with the rifle steady and her breath controlled, and her eye at the scope, until the buck turned and gave her the angle she needed. One shot. He went down cleanly without the protracted drama of a bad hit, the way a well-placed shot in the right location drops an animal. She waited the full 2 minutes before approaching, confirming what she already knew. Then she began the work of processing the animal, where it lay, her knife moving through the familiar motions, the cold air carrying the steam from the carcass upward in a plume that dissipated against the gray sky. 110 pounds of meat and fat, more than she had possessed at any point since her eviction. She sectioned the animal carefully, losing nothing to waste, and transported the quarters back to the cave. In 2 trips, her legs steady under the weight, her back taking the load without the rebellion it would have mounted 2 months earlier. She hung the quarters in the cold section of the cave, near the entrance where the temperature kept them frozen solid. She rendered the fat into a dense, calorie-rich substance she could add to everything she cooked, providing the concentrated energy that lean meat alone could not deliver. She cracked the long bones and extracted the marrow. She boiled the bones for broth that she consumed every evening before sleep. Within 2 weeks, her body had changed. Not back to what it had been before the eviction, that would take months of normal living that were not yet available to her. But the visible ribs receded, the hip bones no longer bruised against the cave floor. The wasting that had hollowed her face and hands began to reverse itself, the muscles rebuilding on the material she was finally giving them to work with. Her mind sharpened with the clarity that returns when the brain receives adequate fuel. The fog that had settled over her thinking during the worst of December and January, that slight dulling of the edge that she had noticed and compensated for, and not been able to correct, because correction required resources, she did not have that fog lifted. She was thinking clearly now, completely, with the full capacity of a mind that had been educated in difficult circumstances and tempered in harder ones, and was now finally working at the level the situation required. She spent the long evenings reading Daniel's journal with the attention of a lawyer preparing for trial. She had read it many times during the winter, but always under conditions of stress or cold or the kind of exhaustion that allowed comprehension, but not full analysis. Now she read it differently with a pen found in the inner pocket of Holt's coat, along with a folded map and $32 in paper currency, making notes in the margins, building a chronological sequence of events, identifying the points at which Elias Vance's actions crossed from moral failure into criminal conduct. The timeline that emerged was precise and damning. Daniel had begun his geological survey in October of 1977, motivated by observations he had made during timber work on the North Ridge. He had kept the survey private initially, not from deception, but from the caution of a man who understood that information about mineral deposits changes the behavior of people who hear it, and he wanted to know what he had before anyone else began making decisions based on it. By April of 1978, he had enough data to understand the scale of what lay beneath the North Ridge. By June, he had assay results that confirmed it. Vance had found him on the ridge in September and understood what he was doing, and Daniel's attempt to deflect had not been successful. And what followed was recorded in the journal in Daniel's precise handwriting, with dates and times and the specific words that were exchanged, the journal of a man who had understood once the confrontation happened, that he was building a record that might matter after he was gone. Clara added her own entries to the journal, now writing in the margins and on the blank pages at the back. She documented her eviction with the specificity of a legal deposition. She recorded every name, every action, every word she could accurately recall. She wrote about the night Vance and his men came to her porch at 4 in the morning. She wrote about what Holt Briggs had said at the fence line. She wrote about the marks on Daniel's throat and what she had seen when she examined him. She wrote about January 25th and what she had heard from her position on the limestone cliff and what had followed from it. She wrote it plainly, without embellishment or excuse, the way she would have written a clinical report, because the truth required no embellishment and would not benefit from excuse. She was building a case, and she was building a witness. The woman who would testify to what Elias Vance had done needed to be unimpeachable, and the only way to be unimpeachable was to document everything accurately and hold nothing back, and let the facts carry the weight that facts carry when they are assembled correctly and completely and without apology. She read Daniel's third to last entry again on the evening of February 20th, sitting close to the fire with the journal open across her knees. The entry detailed something she had noted on her first reading and returned to on every subsequent reading, something that grew in significance each time she considered it. Daniel had written, Vance has been in contact with Harlan and Set Mining out of Helena since at least March. He had a representative visit the settlement last spring, introduced as a church administrator from the regional diocese. I saw the man examining soil samples from the North Ridge. At the time, I did not understand why. Now I do. Vance knew there was something valuable up here before I confirmed it. He was already in negotiation before I found the vein. He needed clear title to the land. Our homestead is the obstacle. I am the obstacle. Clara sat with this for a long time. Vance had not acted impulsively when he had Daniel killed. He had not panicked when Daniel found the silver and decided in the moment to eliminate a complication. He had known about the mineral potential of the land before Daniel's survey confirmed it. He had been in contact with a mining company. He had been building toward this for over a year, positioning himself, managing the community's finances and legal structure, ensuring that the charter provisions that could be used to dispossess the homesteaders were firmly established and accepted as normal procedure before the moment came when he needed to use them. This was not a crime of opportunity. This was a plan, which meant that the families of Salvation Creek, all 47 of them, were not witnesses to what Vance had done. They were his instruments, and they were his cover, and they were also when the contracts with Harlan and Set Mining came due as victims. Because the agreements Daniel had referenced in the journal, the ones he had described as covering the northern land, including multiple homestead claims, those agreements, if they stood, would eventually result in every family in Salvation Creek losing the land they had worked and built on for 6 years. Vance had not just killed her husband to steal their homestead. He had been preparing to dispossess an entire community. Clara closed the journal and sat with this for the rest of that evening, feeling the shape of it, understanding what it meant for the confrontation she was preparing for. She had come into this winter believing she was fighting for Daniel's life to be accounted for, and her own survival to be established and the record to be set right. She was still fighting for all of those things. But she was also, it turned out, fighting for Ruth Mercer and Garrison Mercer and Owen Sutter's mother, and every other person who had built their life on this land in good faith and was about to have it taken from them by a man they trusted with their spiritual guidance and their community governance and the legal framework of their daily existence. She did not forgive them for what they had done and not done. Forgiveness was a transaction that required a willingness she did not have access to and was not certain she would ever have access to, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But fighting for people who needed fighting for was something she understood regardless of whether she forgave them. It was what she had done overseas in conditions where the men whose lives she was trying to preserve were sometimes men whose choices she would not have made. You did the work. The moral accounting was separate. March arrived gradually, the way seasons change in the mountains. Not as a sudden reversal, but as a slow accumulation of small differences that one day add up to something undeniable. The days grew longer in increments that were individually imperceptible and collectively enormous. The temperature still dropped below zero most nights, but the midday hours began to reach into the 20s and occasionally the low 30s. Water ran under the ice of the stream below the cave, with a sound she had not heard since October, the particular sound of moving water, which registered in some deep part of her nervous system as the sound of change of conditions, shifting of the static world of deep winter, beginning to consider other possibilities. She trained every day. She hiked the surrounding ridges in conditions that would have stopped her in November, pushing her stamina back toward the level she would need, moving through the terrain with the pace and the endurance of someone who had been shaped by months of physical necessity into something different from what she had been. She was not heavier than she had been before the winter, but she was different in ways that weight alone did not measure. The movements of a person who has spent 5 months moving across winter wilderness for survival rather than exercise carry a different quality, an economy of effort, an efficiency of attention, a relationship to difficult terrain that is less about conquering it and more about understanding it deeply enough to use it correctly. She practiced with the rifle until the motions were unconscious. Load, aim, breathe, fire. The sequence executed with the automaticity of something that had been done enough times to bypass the deliberative process entirely. At 200 yards, she was consistent. At 150, she was reliable. At the distances she anticipated needing, she did not miss. On the 15th of March, during the 3-day warm spell that raised the temperature above freezing for the first time since autumn, Clara sat outside the cave entrance on a flat boulder that had been in shadow all winter and was now in full sun, and she felt the actual warmth of the March light on her face and closed her eyes. She thought about Daniel, not the details of what had happened to him, not the evidence she had assembled or the case she had built or the confrontation she was moving toward. She thought about the version of him that existed in the margins of his journal, the private notations he had never intended as literary artifact, the small observations about the world and about her that he had recorded the way he recorded everything, with the precision of a man who believed that the world repaid careful observation with genuine knowledge. She thought about a particular afternoon in their first summer in Salvation Creek when they had climbed to a ridge above the settlement to watch a thunderstorm move across the valley from the west, sitting side by side on a flat rock with the lightning playing across the peaks to the south and the smell of rain advancing through the dry heat. And Daniel had turned to her with an expression she associated with his moments of complete contentment and said that he thought this was enough, this right here, that a man who had this had enough. She sat with that memory in the March sun until it became something she could carry rather than something that undid her. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the Bitterroot Mountains in the early light of a spring that was making its intentions clear. She had things to do. On the 10th of April, with the snow reduced to scattered patches on the north-facing slopes and the trails through the lower timber finally passable, Clara Ashford packed what she was taking and took one last look at Whispering Hollow. The cave that had been her fortress and her prison, the place where one version of herself had died and another had been constructed from the materials available. Rock and cold and fury, and a dead man's careful preparation, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had decided that spite was a valid foundation for a life received her last look without comment. Stone did not comment. That was one of its virtues. She had arranged the fire pit stones in a final configuration that would hold the ash and char safely. She had stacked the remaining wood neatly against the wall. She had folded the canvas from Daniel's coat box and placed it on the shelf near the back, where the D scratched into the stone above. It still held the arrow pointing down the mark of a man who had believed in her enough to leave her a map. She touched the mark once with her fingertips. Then she shouldered Holt Briggs's pack, which now contained Daniel's journal, the ore samples from the east wall cache. 3 boxes of matches, she would not need the remaining dried provisions, and the thermos she had washed and filled with boiled water that morning. She carried the Winchester in her right hand with the ease of something that had become ordinary. She walked out of the cave into the April morning. The journey to Salvation Creek took 2 days. The terrain that had nearly killed her in October was transformed by spring into something that was still difficult, but was difficult in the way that trails are difficult, in the manageable way of uneven ground and stream crossings, and gradients that asked something of the legs without asking everything. She moved at a pace that was not hurried. She was not hurrying. The dead do not rush their resurrections. She camped the first night in a stand of old-growth pine, a mile below the Whispering Hollow elevation, building a small fire and eating the last of the dried venison, and looking at the stars that were visible through the canopy, the stars over Montana in April, which were numerous enough to create the impression that the darkness between them was the exception rather than the rule. She arrived at the perimeter of Salvation Creek on the morning of April 13th. She stood on the ridge above the settlement and looked down at it in the early light. 47 cabins arranged in the loose grid the founding families had established in the first months, the fields being turned for spring planting, smoke from breakfast fires rising in thin vertical columns in the still morning air. People moving between buildings in the ordinary purposeful way of people whose day has a shape they can anticipate. None of them looked up at the ridge. Clara checked the rifle one final time. She chambered around the metallic sound, precise and final in the morning quiet. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders. She looked at the settlement for another moment, taking in the details of a place she had helped build and been expelled from and had thought about every day for 5 months. Then she walked down the ridge. Her first sight was a child, a boy of perhaps 8, crossing the open ground between 2 cabins with a water bucket in each hand, his breath making small clouds in the morning air. He looked up and saw her, and the buckets dropped simultaneously, water spreading across the mud in 2 dark patches, and his mouth opened and stayed open, while the rest of him went completely still. Then he ran the way children run when they have seen something that adults need to be told about immediately, with the total commitment of a body that has transferred all available resources to speed. Clara did not change her pace. Within 2 minutes, people were emerging from their cabins. She watched their faces as she walked through the settlement, the progression from confusion to recognition to something that moved through shock and disbelief and fear, and arrived at the far side of those things, at a place she recognized as the look of people who are being required to account for themselves in ways they had not anticipated and for which they had made no preparation. She walked past Ruth Mercer, who stood in the doorway of her cabin with one hand pressed flat against the doorframe and the other covering her mouth, her face the color of the snow patches on the north-facing slopes above the settlement. Ruth's eyes followed her as she passed. Clara did not meet them. There were things that merited acknowledgement and things that did not, and she had decided during 5 months in a cave which category Ruth Mercer's choice fell into. The meeting house stood at the center of the settlement, the largest structure in Salvation Creek, built in the second year with community labor and maintained as the focal point of the community's shared life. The double doors were closed but not latched. Sunday service would be underway. She could hear Elias Vance's voice through the wooden walls before she reached the steps. The practiced cadences of a man who had been preaching for enough years that the delivery had become a separate skill from the content, the voice moving through its register of authority and consolation with the smooth automation of long practice. Clara walked up the steps. She kicked the doors open and walked in. The sound Elias Vance's voice made when it stopped was not silence but something more specific. The abrupt cessation of a mechanism that has encountered an obstacle. The sudden stopping of a thing that had been running. She stood in the open doorway. 43 people in the pews turned to look at her in a single motion. The pale April light came through the windows on both sides and illuminated the center aisle, and she stood at its end with the rifle in her right hand and Daniel's pack on her back. In 5 months of mountain winter in the set of her face, and the way she held her body, which was different from the way she had held it when she had last stood in this building. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. Then someone near the back began to cry, the sound high and involuntary, the sound of someone whose capacity to hold back a response has been exceeded without warning. Clara walked down the center aisle. She did not hurry. She watched Vance as she walked, and she watched him do what she had expected him to do, which was perform his way through the shock toward the register of control he defaulted to in all circumstances. She watched his face cycle through the private version of this and emerge on the other side, wearing the expression of a man who was already working the problem. Sister Clara, he said when she was close enough that he could lower his voice to the pastoral range. His hands were spread on the pulpit surface with the deliberate openness of a man demonstrating transparency. God has answered our prayers and delivered you back to us. We thought you lost. The whole community has been in mourning. Clara stopped 10 feet from the pulpit. She looked at him the way she had looked at the trajectory of the bullet after she drove it through the center of the bark target at 200 yards. With the assessment of someone who has already done the work of understanding what they are dealing with and is no longer in the process of deciding. This is not a miracle, she said. Miracles are gifts. I survived through my husband's preparation and my own stubbornness and the mountain's judgment on the men you sent to find my bones. Vance's expression did not change. This was the face of a man who had long practice at not changing his expression when things were said that he needed to not respond to. He began to speak the words about grief and ordeal and the charter's necessity and the council's difficult decision. And she let him say the words because they were the last words he would say in this room, from that position of authority. And she wanted the people in the pews to hear them clearly, to hear the quality of a man explaining why the thing he did was not the thing it was. When he finished, she reached into the pack and removed Daniel's journal. She held it up so the people in the first rows could see that it was real, a physical object handled and worn and annotated across months of careful use. She said Daniel Ashford was not killed by a falling tree. He was murdered. Murdered for what he found beneath the land this community settled on in good faith. She opened the journal. She read the relevant entries aloud. Not quickly, not dramatically. In the flat, precise voice she had used in the cave when she read Daniel's words into the cold air to keep the sound of him present. She read the entry about the silver vein. She read the entry about Vance finding Daniel on the North Ridge. She read the entry about the meeting at the timber mill. She read the final entry in full, every word including the last ones. The meeting house was very quiet. Murmurs moved through the congregation as the reading progressed. The particular sound of people absorbing information that reorganizes everything they believed they understood about their circumstances. She watched faces move through the sequence. Doubt first, the reflex resistance to information that threatens the stability of established belief. Then the arithmetic of detail, the dates, the specifics, the chemical assay results, the names of men from Helena who had visited Salvation Creek under false pretenses. Then the arithmetic resolving into something harder and less comfortable than doubt. Vance raised his voice when she finished. The words he used, madness, grief, isolation, distorting judgment, a broken woman who could not accept what had happened to her husband, were words she had anticipated and prepared for. She let him use them. She let the room hear them. Then she looked at the people in the pews and said, "The journal documents meetings between Reverend Vance and representatives of a mining company called Harlan and Set out of Helena. It documents the existence of contracts signed and dated for the sale of 500 acres of this valley's land that includes the homesteads of 12 families seated in this room. Those contracts, if they stand, will result in every family in this settlement being removed from their land. Not just Daniel and me, all of you. The quality of the silence changed. It was no longer the silence of people who were uncertain about what they were hearing. It was the silence of people who have heard something that they cannot unhear and whose implications they are beginning to calculate, with the focused urgency of men and women who have just understood that they are not spectators to someone else's misfortune, but participants in their own. Three men rose from the front pew. They moved toward her with the cautious approach of people who had been asked to do something they were not entirely certain they wanted to do, men following the authority of habit rather than conviction. Clara raised the rifle and tracked across all three in a single smooth motion. They stopped mid-step with the unanimity of people who have just understood something that a moment before they had not. "Sit down," she said. "Everyone stays where they are until I am finished." They sat. The room did not move. Garrison Mercer had been sitting in the fourth row on the left side of the aisle. Through all of this, in the seat he occupied every Sunday, in the posture of a man who has spent the service trying to decide something and has not yet succeeded. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the hands of someone who had spent years in physical work, and the face of someone who had spent the same years trying to be fair-minded in circumstances that did not always reward fairness of mind. Howe was looking at his wife. Ruth sat 2 seats to his left, her hands folded in her lap with the careful rigidity of someone holding themselves together through force of will. Clara had not looked at Ruth since she entered the building, and she did not look at her now. But she saw Garrison looking, and she saw what he found there, and she saw what it did to him. The thing that a man sees in the face of the person he loves when they are ashamed, and he understands the full weight of what the shame is about. He saw his wife carrying something that had been eating at her for 5 months. He saw a woman who had made a choice she could not undo and had been living in the shadow of that choice every day since October. He saw the cost of silence when silence is a form of complicity. And he understood in the way that men understand things when the evidence is right in front of them and the moment will not wait that the person who needed to stand up was him. Not because Clara was pointing a rifle at the room. Not because the evidence was overwhelming. Not because he had no choice. Because his children would grow up in this valley and would one day ask him where he stood, and he intended to have an answer he could give them without flinching. Garrison Mercer stood up. He did not look at Clara. He did not speak to her or ask her permission or wait for her direction. He turned to the three men nearest him in the pew and said in a voice that was quiet and not at all theatrical that they were going to go look at what Elias Vance kept in his cabin. He said it the way a man says something he has already decided, not as a proposal, but as a statement of what was about to happen. He walked to the door. 6 men followed him without discussion. Elias Vance's voice rose behind them, the authority in it acquiring a new quality, the quality of something that is discovering the limits of what authority can do when the people it relies on are no longer listening. He said they had no right to enter his private home. He said the charter protected private property. He said they would answer for this violation of community principles. The men walked out the door. Clara kept the rifle on Vance. He looked at her across the distance of the sanctuary with the eyes of a man who is still calculating, still looking for the angle that is not there. She looked back at him with the eyes of a woman who spent 5 months in a cave with nothing but time to understand exactly what he had done and exactly what she intended to do about it. And the rifle between them was a fact that foreclosed a great many of the angles he was looking for. They waited. The room held its breath. Outside, the sounds of men moving with purpose between the buildings carried faintly through the walls. Inside, the only sounds were the settling of the old timber frame and the occasional suppressed sob from somewhere in the back rows and the shallow, controlled breathing of 43 people who had finally understood that the world they thought they were living in was not the world they were actually living in. Vance tried once more. His voice dropped to the intimate register he used for private counsel, the voice of a man offering a confidential truth. "You have suffered greatly," he said. "No one disputes that. What was done to you was severe, and I accept that the council's decision caused you harm. But what you are doing now with these accusations, with this journal that may or may not reflect events accurately, will destroy everything these families have built. Is that what Daniel would have wanted? To see his death used to tear apart a community? Clara looked at him for a long moment. Daniel wanted the truth, she said. He wrote it down so there would be no argument about what it was. He did that because he knew you would say exactly what you just said. He knew you would make his death about the community's well-being. He knew you would find a way to make the accusation seem like the crime. He prepared for you, Reverend Vance. He prepared for you more carefully than you prepared for him. And that is why you are going to lose. Vance had no response to this that he could make work, and she watched him understand that and watched the calculation behind his eyes shift from finding an argument to finding an exit, and watched him understand that there was no exit either, not with the rifle in her hands and the men going through his cabin and the room full of people who were beginning to understand what had been done to them. Garrison Mercer returned in 40 minutes. He came through the doors with his arms full of things he had found in Elias Vance's cabin, things that were now distributed between himself and the 5 men who followed him back into the meeting house, and deposited their contents on the floor in front of the first pew with the deliberate care of men presenting evidence rather than making an accusation. Chunks of silvery ore, their surfaces catching the light from the windows with the unmistakable gleam of high-grade silver. A metal strongbox that Garrison set down with the weight of something substantial inside it, a leather satchel, and a stack of papers, folded documents that unfolded to reveal the letterhead of Harlan and Set Mining Company of Helena, Montana, dated and signed in Elias Vance's handwriting across multiple pages, covering multiple transactions spanning more than a year. Garrison looked at Clara for the first time since he had stood up. His expression was not that of a man who had done something heroic. It was the expression of a man who had done what needed to be done and understood that doing it did not cancel what had not been done previously, and was prepared to carry both things for as long as necessary. It's all here, he said. Everything, she said. The contracts cover the North Quarter, the Aldrin homestead, the Beaumont claim, the Sutherland parcel, and ours. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had changed slightly, the change of a man reading words that have just made personal what was previously abstract. And the Ashford homestead. He opened the strongbox. The bills inside were bound in the careful way of money that has been accumulated and organized over time, the money of a man who was certain he would eventually need it in a hurry. He looked at the amount without touching it. Then he looked at Vance. The room erupted, not with violence but with the sound of people who have been holding something contained for too long when the container breaks. Voices overlapping, some in anger at Vance, some in the desperate register of people trying to find an interpretation that allows the version of events they had been living inside to survive a little longer, some in the simple language of people who have been used and understand it now and are not able to moderate their response to that understanding. Vance tried to speak. Clara could hear him beneath the noise, could hear him still working the angles, still finding the framing that made what he had done into something defensible, still performing the role of reasonable authority with the persistence of a man who had never encountered a situation where that performance failed to produce results. Ruth Mercer stood up. She stood with the specific abruptness of someone who has made a decision and is acting on it before the decision can be reconsidered. And when she spoke, it was not to Vance and not to the room, but in the direction of the floor in front of her, as though she were testifying to something that required honesty about what she knew and what she had chosen to do with what she knew. She said that she had known not everything but enough, that Vance had told certain members of the community members whose continued cooperation he needed, that Daniel Ashford had been creating problems that the community could not sustain, that the situation had been resolved in the community's best interests, that she had understood what resolve meant, that she had said nothing, that she had told herself she was protecting her family, that she had known on the morning of Clara's eviction what she was watching and had stood there and watched it anyway. She stopped speaking. The room was very quiet. Clara looked at Ruth Mercer for the first time since she had entered the building. She looked at her for a long moment, looking at the woman who had pulled her hand away at the graveside and had stood at the back of the crowd on the morning of the eviction and had chosen the thing she had chosen. She looked at her long enough to see the full weight of what Ruth was carrying and to understand that Ruth would carry it without resolution for the rest of her life, which was not justice but was its own kind of sentence, and that no words from Clara would lighten it or make it heavier than it already was. Then Clara looked away. Garrison Mercer crossed the room and took Elias Vance by the arm with the firm but not violent grip of a man who has decided what comes next and is executing the decision without anger and without ceremony. Vance's resistance was verbal, only the words of a man who had built his power entirely on other people's willingness to comply with it, and was now discovering the precise dimensions of what his power actually was when that willingness was removed. "Is there any objection to confining Reverend Vance until legal authorities can be summoned?" Garrison asked the room. The room did not object. Clara lowered the rifle. She did not accept the offers of hospitality that came in the hours that followed, tentative and guilt-laden and sincere in their way, but representing a kind of proximity she did not have the capacity for. She slept in the meeting house on the wooden pew that was hard and uncomfortable and represented a form of distance she needed from the people who had watched her eviction in October and were now offering her their guest rooms, which was a transaction she was not prepared to enter into. She spent the time waiting, organizing the evidence into a coherent narrative for the authorities she knew would come. The journal, the ore samples, the contracts, the strongbox and its contents, all of it cataloged and sequenced in the order that told the story. Most clearly, the order that required the least interpretation, the order that let the facts speak in the voice Daniel had intended for them when he sat in this valley and wrote down everything he knew. Garrison Mercer rode to Missoula that afternoon. 40 miles of spring trail that would take him until nightfall and require a fresh horse for the return journey, which he arranged before he left by trading a favor with a family whose horse was rested and whose debt to Garrison predated any of this by several years. He returned 2 days later with Sheriff Daniel Reeves, a federal land agent named Carver, whose face suggested he had seen many versions of this kind of situation and found them consistently wearying, and a territorial prosecutor named Walsh, who asked very precise questions and wrote down the answers in a notebook that he kept in his breast pocket. Sheriff Reeves spent 6 hours with the journal and the contracts and the ore samples and the strong box and the men and women of Salvation Creek who were willing to tell him what they knew. He was a careful man, not quick in either direction, the kind of law officer who understands that the impulse toward rapid conclusion is usually working against rather than toward accuracy. He listened more than he spoke. When he had finished listening, he stood up and arrested Elias Vance on charges that the prosecutor Walsh enumerated from his notebook in the flat sequential language of formal accusation. As they led Vance out of the root cellar, where he had been confined, and toward the wagon that would take him to Missoula to await trial, he passed close enough to Clara that she could have reached out and touched him if she had wanted to, which she did not. He stopped. The men on either side of him allowed it. He looked at her with the pale eyes that she had last seen calculating his way through a situation that no longer admitted of calculation, and he said that she had destroyed everything he had built, everything the community represented, everything that had been good about this place. Clara looked at him the way she had been looking at things since October, with the assessment of someone who has stripped away everything that is not accurate and has learned to see what remains with a clarity that is neither cruel nor merciful, but simply precise. "You destroyed it," she said. "The morning you met my husband at the timber mill, I just made sure people knew." They took him to the wagon. She watched him go. She did not feel the catharsis that stories suggest should arrive at such moments, the clean emotional resolution of a wrong made right. What she felt was more functional than that, the recognition that a process had been set in motion that would proceed without her needing to hold it up. That Daniel's careful documentation had done what he intended it to do. That the mountain had held her long enough for her to come back and do what needed to be done. She had done what she came to do. The legal proceedings took the months they took. Elias Vance was tried in July of 1979 on 2 counts of first-degree murder, Daniel Ashford, and in an addition that surprised Clara when the prosecutor Walsh informed her of it, Holt Briggs, whose death the prosecution characterized as the foreseeable consequence of an assignment Vance had made knowing its likely outcome. Owen Sutter's death was included in the same characterization. Clara testified for a full day. She spoke in the same flat, precise voice she had used in the cave when she read Daniel's words aloud, to keep herself present, the voice of someone who has processed what they experienced sufficiently to report it accurately and without the editorializing that damages credibility. The defense questioned her stability, her sanity, the reliability of a woman who had spent 5 months alone in the wilderness, which the prosecutor Walsh addressed with the medical testimony of the physician who had examined her on her return and found her physically depleted but mentally precise, her account of events consistent with the physical evidence in ways that could not be fabricated. Vance was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 30 years in the territorial penitentiary, which would exceed his probable remaining lifespan by a significant margin. The territorial prosecutor Walsh also successfully challenged the Harlan and Set contracts as fraudulently executed Vance, having lacked the authority to enter binding agreements affecting individual homestead claims without the knowledge or consent of the people whose land those claims covered. The contracts were voided. The land remained with the families who had settled it. The homestead claim that Daniel Ashford had filed with the county 3 years prior, the claim that covered the North Ridge and the silver vein beneath it, was confirmed as belonging to Clara Ashford as sole heir to Daniel Ashford's estate. The land agent Carver met with her twice in Missoula before the trial to discuss the mineral rights and the practical implications of what the North Ridge contained. He was a precise man who understood that the numbers he was conveying were ones she had not had occasion to contextualize, and he conveyed them with the care of someone who understands that the distance between a person's financial reality and the numbers they are being told can be large enough to constitute a form of disorientation. $340,000 was the figure the Denver Mining Company put forward when their representative came to Missoula in September of 1979 to discuss the acquisition of 60% of the mineral rights. This was not a final number, the representative said. This was an opening number. Clara told him it was the final number. He accepted it. Before the papers were signed, she had her attorney draft a separate agreement, establishing that 40% of the mineral rights would be held by a consortium of the Salvation Creek families administered through a trust, structured to ensure that the income could not be alienated from its intended beneficiaries by any future arrangement that might appear in the community's governance. People asked her why. They asked in the direct way that people ask things when they genuinely do not understand the reasoning behind a decision that appears to benefit people who had not earned the benefit. She said Daniel would have wanted this, and this is what I can give him. It was the truest answer she had, and also the most complete one, and she did not elaborate on it because it did not require elaboration. Daniel had spent a year surveying those mountains not because he wanted to be wealthy, but because he believed that what was beneath the land belonged to the people who had committed their lives to living above it. He had died trying to find a way to make that happen fairly. She would make it happen the way that was available to her, which was the only way left. She left Salvation Creek for the last time in November of 1979, when the first serious snow of the season was beginning to find the high passes, and the Bitterroot Mountains were assuming the white configuration she had come to know as thoroughly as she had ever known any landscape. The community had voted to rename itself Ashford's Hope, a gesture she accepted without comment, which was the most she had to give. Ruth Mercer came to say goodbye. She stood at the edge of the road with her coat buttoned to the collar and her hands folded in front of her with the posture of someone who has been practicing what they intended to say and has lost confidence in it on arrival. She said that she was sorry. She said it several times in slightly different arrangements, as though the right combination of words might find a way through what she could see in Clara's face. Clara looked at her for a moment. Ruth had been her closest friend in this place, the person she had sat up with through 3 nights of fever, the person she had trusted with the ordinary dailiness of her life in Salvation Creek. The betrayal of that friendship was not something that had diminished with time. It had clarified the way all things clarify when you have spent enough time with them in a cold and quiet place. Your prayers did not keep me warm, Clara said. The mountain did. You made your choice in October. Live with it. She turned and walked to the horse she had purchased with a portion of the advance payment, adjusted the pack behind the saddle, and rode west toward Missoula without looking back. She arrived in Seattle in January of 1980, in the middle of the city's mild version of winter that felt after Montana like a climate that had decided not to be serious about itself. She purchased the struggling veterinary clinic on the recommendation of an attorney who had heard from another attorney who had heard that a woman with money and a nursing background was looking for purposeful work in a city large enough to disappear into and small enough to build something in. She hired a licensed veterinarian to manage the clinical work and learned the practice alongside him. Her surgical background translating into the animal context with the pragmatic efficiency of skills that are fundamentally about precision and care regardless of the specific patient. She was good at it. Not immediately, but with the progressive competence of someone who applies genuine attention to what they are learning and is not in a hurry to pretend to mastery before mastery is actual. Within 5 years, the clinic had expanded. Within 10, she had trained several young veterinarians who went on to their own practices carrying a standard of work she recognized as the standard she had tried to model for them. She never remarried. There were occasions when the question presented itself in the form of men who found in her the qualities that quiet, competent, self-sufficient women can project without intending to project them. She was courteous in those situations and clear. She had learned in Whispering Hollow that she was sufficient unto herself, which was not a statement about loneliness, but a statement about adequacy. She had what she needed to build a life with, and she built one that was full and purposeful and entirely her own. Ruth Mercer wrote letters for 3 years. They arrived at the Seattle address that Clara had shared with Garrison, who had shared it with Ruth, which Clara had anticipated and not attempted to prevent, because preventing it would have been its own kind of ongoing attention to something she had decided to release. She read the first 2 letters. They were long and earnest and moved through the same sequence of remorse and explanation and hope for response. The third letter she left unopened on her desk for a week, then placed it in the drawer with the other mail she intended to deal with. Eventually, then one evening understood that there was nothing she intended to do about it, and never would be, and placed it in the box in the closet where it stayed. The letters stopped after 3 years. Some distances established at certain moments under certain circumstances do not close. This was one of them, and Clara had made her peace with that fact, in the same way she had made her peace with many facts during 5 months in a cave, by looking at it directly until it was simply a fact and not a source of ongoing pain. She donated money every year to causes that addressed the specific intersection of vulnerability and exposure that she understood from the inside organizations that helped women who had been put outside with nothing, who were surviving on the mathematics of inadequate resources in hostile conditions, who needed not sympathy but capacity. She donated anonymously. She did not attend the events. She did not want acknowledgement for doing what seemed to her obvious. She did not speak publicly about Montana or Salvation Creek or the winter of 1978 into 1979. She did not give interviews. She did not authorize the accounts of her that circulated through Ashford's Hope across the decades, some of which were accurate and some of which were not, and all of which she regarded with the equanimity of someone who understood that stories told about a person are never really about the person, but about what the people telling them need to believe about the world they live in. What she needed was different. What she needed was the work and the quiet of her own life, and the occasional evening when she sat with a glass of whiskey in Daniel's journal and read the margin notations until she could remember the exact quality of his voice speaking the words he had written, the precise acoustic reality of him that she had been afraid of losing on that December night in the cave, when the silence had pressed in close enough to take even that from her. She never lost it again. The mine had begun operations in 1981, providing Ashford's Hope with an income that transformed the settlement from a struggling commune into a modest but stable small town. Schools were built, a proper church with a minister who had not murdered anyone, a medical clinic staffed by a rotating physician from Missoula. Families who had come to Salvation Creek with the specific hope of building something lasting found that they were against all the odds that Elias Vance's betrayal had created building it. Garrison Mercer sent occasional letters over the years, practical updates on the community's progress, brief notes about how the children were growing, information about the mine's output and the trust's distributions. Clara read these and sometimes responded with brief notes of her own that acknowledged the information without inviting further conversation. She was glad the people had found something good from the ashes of Vance's corruption. She could hold that gladness at a distance that allowed her to feel it without requiring her to be present for it. Clara Ashford died in her home in Seattle in the spring of 2019, in the early morning hours, without drama and without distress. She was 75 years old. She had been in mild decline for several months and had arranged her affairs with the thoroughness of someone who had been keeping careful records and building careful structures for 40 years, and saw no reason to approach her own conclusion differently from any other significant undertaking. Her will established the Daniel Ashford Memorial Scholarship for women pursuing veterinary medicine with preference for applicants who had overcome significant hardship, which the scholarship committee interpreted broadly in the first years, and then with increasing precision as the population of applicants made the scope of the criterion clear. The fund was substantial. It would run for a long time. Her obituary in the Seattle Times noted her ownership of the clinic, her philanthropic work, and her reputation in the animal welfare community for taking the difficult cases that others declined. It made no mention of Montana. That part of her life remained what she had chosen to make it a private thing, a story she had lived rather than told, preferring to let the court records and the distant legend of Ashford's Hope speak for themselves in whatever way they chose to. In Ashford's Hope, now a town of 1,400 people, with a school and a hospital and two churches, and the steady, modest prosperity that the silver mine had provided across 4 decades before the vein finally ran thin in 2001. The news of her death arrived through the channels that such news travels and was received with the particular grief of people who understand that something has ended, that was irreplaceable not because she had been present in their lives, but because the fact of her survival had been the foundation on which everything they had was built. The town council organized a memorial service in the larger of the two churches, the one built in 1985 with community funds, when the original meeting house finally exceeded its useful life. Over 200 people attended, filling the pews and the standing areas along the side walls and the space near the back doors that was technically a vestibule and was pressed into service as overflow. They sang hymns that had been sung in this valley for decades, hymns that had been sung in the original meeting house before it was torn down, hymns that carried in their melodies the particular weight of music that has been used to mark significant occasions until it has absorbed something of their significance. They shared accounts, most of them second-hand or third-hand, the stories of a woman few of them had met, but all of them had grown up hearing about stories that had passed through 2 generations of telling and retained the things that stories retain when they carry genuine weight, the essential shape of what had happened and why it mattered, the core of the thing that does not erode even as the details shift. They spoke about the winter, about the cave, about the journal Daniel had buried for her in the dark, about the morning she came back down the ridge with a rifle on her shoulder, and something in her face that the old ones described and the young ones tried to imagine, and none of them in any generation quite captured in words, because there are things that can only be communicated by direct witness, and this was one of them. At the end of the service, the pastor called for a moment of silence. 200 people went quiet at once, which is its own particular sound, the sound of collective breath, suspended of attention, turned inward simultaneously of a large group of people choosing together to stop making noise out of respect for something that deserved more than noise. In that silence, the wind came up outside. It moved through the mountain valley with the authority of something that had been doing this since before any of the buildings in the valley existed, finding the gaps in the window frames and pressing against the glass and moving around the corners of the church with a sound that was not quite words, but was not words either. The sound of air moving through shaped spaces, which is the closest a mountain ever gets to language. A boy of 8 sitting between his mother and his grandfather in the 4th row turned to the old man beside him and asked in a whisper that was louder than he intended, "Was she afraid?" The old man was 71 years old, a retired school teacher who had lived his entire life in Ashford's Hope, and whose earliest clear memory was of standing in a dirt yard on a cold April morning at age 8 and dropping a water bucket, when he looked up and saw a woman coming down the ridge with a rifle on her shoulder, and something in her face that made every adult around him go very still, made them stop what they were doing and just stand there looking in the particular arrested way of people who are witnessing something they will spend the rest of their lives trying to find adequate words for. He looked at his grandson for a moment. The boy's face was open and serious, the face of a child who has asked a real question and is waiting for a real answer. The old man looked at the window and the mountains beyond it, the Bitterroot Mountains that had been there before any of them, and would be there long after the mountains that had tried to kill a woman one winter, and had instead made her into something the valley was still living inside of all these decades later. She was, he said, and she did what needed to be done anyway. The moment of silence ended. The congregation exhaled together, a sound like the releasing of something long held. The pastor spoke the closing words. Outside, the wind continued its passage through the valley, the way wind does, indifferent to conclusions, moving through the landscape, with no particular destination and no particular hurry, carrying nothing and carrying everything, the way the mountain always had and would continue to do for longer than anyone in that room could usefully imagine. The people filed out into the April afternoon, into the light of a Montana spring that had the particular quality of springs in high country, clean and bright, and carrying in it the specific promise of seasons that have survived their own severest tests and emerged on the other side intact. They went back to their lives in a town that bore her husband's name in a valley where the silver had run out, but the schools and the hospital and the trust remained in a place that existed in the form it existed in because one woman had counted 11 matches in the dark and decided that was enough to begin with. The wind moved through the valley. The mountains held their silence. And somewhere in the stone of a limestone cliff, 5 miles northeast in a cave that no one visited anymore, and that most people had forgotten the mark of a man who had believed in his wife enough to leave her a map, remained scratched into the wall exactly where he had put it. The letter D, and below it an arrow pointing down patient and permanent in the dark, the way love is when it is made of the right materials.